Are you lost, Grandpa? The voice was sharp. It was young. It was laced with the kind of confident irritation that only a man in his 20s, wearing a uniform of immense authority, could properly muster. The old man did not turn. He remained still, a solitary gray rock in a sea of digital camouflage and nervous energy. His eyes were fixed on the distant heat shimmer, a hazy curtain dancing over the baked earth of the sniper range. Far out, almost 2,000 yards away, a steel target taunted the best marksman the United States Marine Corps had to offer. And the best were failing. A biting crosswind, mercurial and cruel, was playing games with their multi-thousand-dollar bullets. It was making fools of their advanced ballistic computers. It was making a mockery of their state-of-the-art rifles, gleaming black things of polymer and carbon fiber. The old man's name was Samuel Miller. Nobody here knew that. To them, he was just some civilian guest of a junior officer, a forgotten piece of baggage left near the observation tower. He wore simple khaki pants and a faded blue work shirt. His hands, resting on a long, heavy case at his feet, were a roadmap of hard years. Knuckles like knots in old rope, skin like worn leather. Gunnery Sergeant Kyle Thorne strode closer, his boots crunching on the gravel with practiced impatience. He was the chief range instructor. The failures of his shooters were a direct reflection on him, and his patience had been scoured away by the wind. "Sir, this is a live-fire exercise for active duty personnel," Thorne said, his voice louder this time, each word clipped and precise. "A restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to return to the observation building." Samuel finally turned his head. His neck moved slowly, deliberately. His eyes were pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, unnerving calm. They looked at Thorne, but they seemed to look right through him, seeing the swagger, the pride, the fragile certainty of youth. "Wind's tricky," Samuel said. His voice was quiet, a low rasp like stones rubbing together. Thorne's jaw tightened. He placed his hands on his hips, a classic posture of unimpeachable authority. "We're aware of the conditions, sir," he said, the "sir" a deliberate, condescending jab. "We have technology for that. Kestrels, ballistic solvers. It's a bit more advanced than licking your finger and holding it in the air." A few of the younger Marines nearby snickered. They were frustrated, and the old man was a welcome distraction. Samuel's gaze drifted back to the range. He watched a puff of dust explode a good 10 feet to the left of the target. Another miss. "Your computers are listening to the wind down here," Samuel said, his voice still a low murmur. "But the wind up there, where the bullet lives, that's a different animal. It's telling a different story." This was too much for Thorne. The insolence of it. This fossil, this relic, questioning his methods. Questioning his team. "Right." Thorne scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose you know that story. Let me guess, you were a world-class shooter in your day." Samuel offered no reply. He simply looked down at the long, rectangular case by his feet. It was made of wood, reinforced with battered brass at the corners. It had no combination locks, no pressure seals. It was held shut by two simple, worn leather straps. Thorne's eyes followed his gaze. A smirk spread across his face. "What's in there, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. "A magic wand? Your old hunting rifle from the 50s? The laughter from the Marines was louder this time. It was cruel. Samuel Miller did not seem to hear it. He knelt, his old knees cracking in protest, and with slow, deliberate movements, he began to unbuckle the leather straps. The sound of the worn leather pulling through the brass buckles was a quiet, intimate thing in the vast, windy space. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded red felt, was a rifle. It was not a sleek, black instrument of modern warfare. It was a thing of wood and steel. A heavily modified M14, its walnut stock dark with age and oil, scarred with the nicks and gouges of a long, hard life. A massive, archaic-looking scope was mounted to its receiver. It was beautiful. It was obsolete. Thorne stared, then burst out laughing. It was a harsh, braying sound. "You have got to be kidding me," he choked out, gesturing for his men to look. "A museum piece. You probably 3D printed that scope in your garage." He stepped forward, his arrogance a tangible force. He reached down, not asking, and touched the rifle stock. His finger, young and clean, traced one of the deeper scars in the wood. This antique couldn't hit the broadside of a barn from here, he declared, flicking the stock with his finger. A small, contemptuous tap. It belongs on a wall, not a range. The tap. The flick of his finger against the wood. It was nothing. A minor physical act of disrespect. But for Samuel Miller, it was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 50 years. The wind on the range dissolved. The bright California sun vanished. He was cold. So terribly cold. The air was thin, smelling of pine and cordite and fear. It was a valley, somewhere high in a mountain range no one would ever put on a map. Snow clung to the peaks above him, a jagged crown of white against a bruised purple sky. Below, 30 Marines were pinned down, caught in a brutal, L-shaped ambush. The chatter of enemy machine guns echoed off the granite walls, a sound like a giant tearing sheet metal. He was alone, 1,000 yards above them on a precarious ledge, the only overwatch they had. And he had one rifle. This rifle. He could feel the cold of the rock seeping into his bones. He could feel the familiar weight of the M14, a solid, dependable presence in a world of chaos. He called it the shepherd's crook, because with it, he guided his flock through the valley of the shadow of death. He remembered the shot. Not a shot, the shot. The one the computers would have called impossible. The one that defied physics. A single enemy officer, visible for less than a second, coordinating the attack from a cave mouth across the canyon. The wind was a demon that day, howling down from the peaks, swirling in unpredictable eddies. There was no time for calculations. There was only instinct. Only the feel of the wind on his face. Only the knowledge of his rifle, of how it breathed, how it lived. He held his breath, let half of it out, and the valley rang with the singular, authoritative crack of his M14. He felt the memory of the recoil, a solid, reassuring punch against his shoulder. He remembered the silence that followed. The impossible, beautiful silence. The flick of the finger brought him back. Samuel blinked. The sun was bright again. The wind was just wind. And the arrogant young face of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was still sneering down at him. Something had shifted in the old man's eyes. The placid calm was still there, but beneath it, a fire had been kindled. A single, hot ember glowing in the deep. He looked at Thorne. "This rifle," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet, "has earned more respect than you have yet to comprehend, son." Thorne's face flushed with anger. "Is that a threat?" "It's a statement of fact," Samuel replied, his gaze unwavering. Over by the communications tent, Staff Sergeant Eva Rostova had been watching the entire exchange. She was Thorne's second in command, and while she respected his skill, she was often unsettled by his hubris. Something about the old man held her attention. It was his stillness. In a place of constant motion and noise, he was a point of absolute tranquility. It wasn't weakness. It was a profound, unshakable control. She had seen the rifle. She had seen Thorne's contempt. And she had seen the look in the old man's eyes when the gunnery sergeant touched his weapon. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. Something sacred being profaned. As Samuel stood, she caught a glimpse of his wrist. A faded tattoo, blurred by age and sun. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a stylized ghost hovering over a deep valley. A bell went off in her head. A distant memory from a history seminar at Quantico. A lecture on deniable operations. On heroes whose stories were never told. The ghost of the valley. A legend, a myth. A single sniper who held off an entire battalion for 2 days. They never named him. Her gut screamed at her. Thorne was now puffed up, ready to escalate. "You want to make statements? Fine. Prove it. The range is yours. Let's see what your piece of junk can do. Put a round on that 2,000-yard target. Break the range record. Show us all how it's done, old-timer." It was the ultimate humiliation, a challenge he knew the old man could never meet. Samuel Miller looked at Thorne. He looked at the eager, mocking faces of the young Marines. He looked down at the shepherd's crook. Slowly, he nodded once. Staff Sergeant Rostova didn't wait. She turned, her back to the unfolding drama, and walked briskly toward the comms tent. She pulled out her satellite phone, her fingers flying across the keypad. She didn't call her company commander. She didn't call the base colonel. She bypassed the entire chain of command. She called the direct line to the aide of the commanding general of the entire base. The aide, a brisk major, answered with annoyance in his voice. Major Evans. Major, this is Staff Sergeant Rostova at the Advanced Sniper Range, she said, keeping her voice low and urgent. Apologies for the direct call, sir, but we have a situation. What is it, Staff Sergeant? The major sighed, clearly busy. There's a civilian here, sir. An old man. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne is challenging him on the line. And this requires General Vance's attention. Rostova took a breath. Sir, the man's name is Miller. Samuel Miller. He has an old M14, says he calls it the Shepherd's Crook. And Major, he has a tattoo on his wrist. A ghost over a valley. Silence. Complete, deafening silence on the other end of the line. For a full 5 seconds, Rostova thought the call had dropped. Then the Major's voice came back, and every trace of annoyance had been replaced by a raw, naked urgency that made the hair on her arms stand up. Staff Sergeant, he said, his voice a strained whisper. Listen to me very carefully. You keep that man on your range. Do not let him leave. Do not let your gunnery sergeant lay another hand on him. Do you understand me? The general is on his way. He is coming now. The line went dead. Rostova turned back toward the firing line. Samuel Miller was moving with a slow, fluid grace that belied his age. He lifted the heavy rifle from its case as if it weighed nothing. He bypassed the fancy shooting benches, the sandbags, the high-tech rests. He simply laid down on the dusty ground, pulling a small, worn leather roll from his pocket. He propped the rifle's forestock on the roll. It was a simple, practiced motion. He wasn't looking at a computer. He wasn't consulting a wind meter. He was just watching, feeling. Thorne stood over him, arms crossed, a smug, triumphant look on his face. This would be over in a moment. One pathetic, missed shot, and he could send the old man packing. As Samuel settled behind the scope, a low rumble began to build in the distance. It grew rapidly, becoming the sound of powerful engines moving at high speed. Every head turned. Over the rise, a convoy of 3 black, immaculate SUVs appeared, kicking up a massive plume of dust. They weren't base security. They were command vehicles. They sped down the service road and screeched to a halt just yards from the firing line, doors flying open before they had even stopped moving. From the lead vehicle emerged a man who radiated an aura of absolute command. General Marcus Vance. 4 stars glittered on his collar. His face, usually a mask of stern professionalism, was now a thundercloud of cold fury. His command staff and security detail spilled out after him, struggling to keep pace. The general ignored them all. He ignored the salutes that snapped up around him. He ignored Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, who had gone pale and rigid. His eyes, like chips of granite, were fixed on only one thing: the stooped figure of the old man lying on the ground. He strode forward, his boots eating up the distance with terrifying purpose. He walked right past Thorne as if the gunnery sergeant were a ghost. He stopped 5 feet behind Samuel Miller. The entire range had fallen silent. The only sound was the whistling of the wind. Samuel did not seem to notice the 4-star general standing behind him. He was in his own world, a world of breath and trigger pull and wind. He took a long, slow breath. He let half of it out. The world seemed to hold its breath with him. The old M14 cracked. It was not the sharp, supersonic whip of the modern rifles. It was a deeper, more resonant boom, a sound like history speaking. For a full second, there was nothing. Then, echoing back from the distant hillside, faint but unmistakable, came a single, clear, musical ping. A perfect hit. A center mass strike on a 2,000-yard target in a treacherous crosswind with an ancient rifle on the first try. He had not just hit the target. He had broken the official range record by a margin no one thought possible. In the ringing silence that followed, General Vance took 1 step forward. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand to his brow and rendered the sharpest, most profound salute of his entire decorated career. His voice, when he spoke, was a booming, emotional thunder that rolled across the range. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of respect. "It is an honor, sir." Samuel slowly pushed himself up, his old bones protesting. He turned, his pale blue eyes meeting the general's. He gave a small, weary nod of acknowledgement. General Vance held the salute for a moment longer, then dropped his hand and turned to face the assembled crowd of stunned, silent Marines. His eyes swept over them, and then they landed on Gunnery Sergeant Kyle Thorne. The fury in them was now a controlled, Arctic cold. "Do you know who this is?" Vance's voice was dangerously quiet now. It was a quiet that was far more terrifying than any shout. No one answered. They barely breathed. "This is Samuel Miller," the general said, his voice rising again, each word a hammer blow of revelation. "To the history books, he is a ghost, a footnote in a redacted file. But to the men of the 5th Marines who served in the Anza Valley, he is a legend. We called him the Shepherd, some called him the Ghost of the Valley." He pointed a finger, not at Samuel, but at the rifle now resting on the ground. "You see that rifle?" he roared, and Thorne flinched. "You see that museum piece?" In 1968, during Operation Shepherd's Call, a 30-man long-range reconnaissance patrol was ambushed, pinned down, and slated for annihilation. They had no air support. They had no artillery. They had one man on overwatch, 1,000 yards up a cliff face, with that rifle. The general stepped closer to Thorne, his eyes boring into the younger man's soul. For 2 days and 2 nights, Mr. Miller lay on a frozen ledge, protecting those men. He made shots that ballistic science to this day says are impossible. He took out an entire enemy command structure, one by one, from a distance no one thought survivable. He saved all 30 of those men. I know this, because I was one of the young lieutenants pinned down on that valley floor, praying for a miracle. Mr. Miller was our miracle. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He was offered the Medal of Honor. He refused it. He was offered a commission. He refused it. He asked for only one thing, to be allowed to keep his rifle. He left the service and vanished, asking for no fame, no glory. He came here today, at my personal invitation, to see if the new generation was living up to the standards he set. Finally, Vance turned his full, undivided attention to Thorne. The general's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Gunnery Sergeant, you stand on ground that should be considered sacred. You wear a uniform that men like him bled to sanctify, and you used your rank, your authority, to mock a living legend. You mistook humility for frailty. You mistook age for weakness. You mistook history for junk. You have disgraced your uniform today more than any enemy action ever could." Thorne's face was ashen. The swagger, the arrogance, it had all been stripped away, leaving only a hollow, sickening shame. He looked from the general to the old man, his world completely upended. Samuel Miller stepped forward then, picking up his rifle with a familiar reverence. He looked at the shattered young Marine. "The wind is tricky, son," he said, his voice gentle, without a trace of triumph. "It doesn't care about your computers. It doesn't care about your rank. It only asks for respect. You have to listen to it." He patted the stock of the shepherd's crook. "Same with this. You have to listen to what history is trying to tell you." General Vance gave a sharp nod to his aide. "Major, as of this moment, we are instituting a new, mandatory training module for all range personnel and sniper candidates on this base. It will be a history course, focusing on the Corps' unsung heroes. We will call it the Miller Protocol. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne and his entire staff will be its first students." The consequence was not a demotion. It was not a punishment. It was an education. It was a far more profound judgment. Months passed. The story of that day on the range became a quiet legend on the base, a cautionary tale about hubris. Kyle Thorne was a changed man. The sharp edges of his arrogance had been worn smooth. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. He had taken the Miller Protocol to heart, spending his free time in the base library, reading about the forgotten battles and the quiet men who had fought them. He had learned to listen. One rainy Saturday, he was in a small diner off base, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as the bell over the door jingled. Samuel Miller walked in, shaking the rain from his old coat. He moved to a small booth in the corner, alone. Thorne's heart hammered in his chest. He watched the old man for a long moment, then stood up and walked over. He bought a cup of coffee from the counter and carried it to Samuel's table. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice quiet. Samuel looked up, his pale blue eyes showing a flicker of recognition. "May I?" Thorne asked, gesturing to the empty seat. Samuel nodded. Thorne sat down, placing the coffee on the table. He didn't know what to say. The shame of that day was still a fresh wound. "I wanted to apologize," Thorne finally managed, his voice thick. For my conduct on the range. For my disrespect. There's no excuse for it, sir. Samuel Miller looked at the young Marine. He saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. He saw the humility that had been so painfully learned. A small, quiet smile touched the old man's lips. He reached out a weathered hand and tapped the table gently. A lesson learned is a victory, son, Samuel said. That's all that ever matters. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze distant, as if looking back across the years to a cold valley under a bruised sky. Never forget, he added, his voice a near whisper. The target is never the point. Hitting it is.